This is the module. What we'll first do is define the two approaches we will be using throughout this project, which are the cultural approach and the comparative approach. Cultural approach. The goal of the cultural approach is to discover the deeply held values and beliefs of a culture that produced a myth. Culture captures all that is human-made and learned, especially through language. Yes, that would include myth. Understanding different cultures through myth can help you understand why the myth is the way it is, or the reason for the myth, or even the characters in the myth. Such as in the Enuma Elish, it is obvious that they have a culture that practiced polytheism because there are many gods in that story. It is important to view and understand the culture of a myth. Myth is a part of culture itself, as some myths have remained a part of some cultures for centuries. We'll now be defining the comparative approach. This approach is much broader and much more straightforward. When using the comparative approach, the reader can document trends that are similar and both different in the stories. You can list how humans were made or who they were made in creation for. An example is the Enuma Elish in Genesis once again. While reading, you could easily note down that the creations of humans in the Enuma Elish and Genesis were vastly different. You could use that data and research to try to understand why the gods needed a sacrifice for humans. In Genesis, humans were created by God with no mentions of a sacrifice. In the Enuma Elish and Genesis alike, it is said that God made mankind and they would represent the image of the gods. It is important to not only understand the similarities and differences in myths while using the comparative approach, but also to understand the why. Why did the gods in the Enuma Elish need a sacrifice? Why did God want human to be an image of himself? The Enuma Elish versus Genesis cultural approach. We will start by using the cultural approach to analyze and observe the mythology of the Enuma Elish and Genesis. You have to understand that culturally, these two stories are quite different in their beliefs. In Enuma Elish, it is said to have many different gods, but Genesis only has one. It was mentioned prior that this is an example of polytheism, which is the belief of many different gods. The definition of polytheism is as follows. It characterizes all religions besides Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which all believe in one God. Genesis stems from Christianity. So, in Enuma Elish, there are many gods. In Genesis, there's only one. In Genesis, the steps that God took to create the universe and its beings were mentioned. These were essentially the steps that God took for the creation of the universe. In the creation story of the Enuma Elish, though, there were fights amongst the gods. You can see immediately that the stories differ in their delivery, tone, characters, and setting. You can tell that culturally, these two stories were not much alike, even though they were both creation stories. Enuma Elish versus Genesis comparative approach. Now that we've identified some of the cultural differences and beliefs, we can view these stories in a comparative approach to identify similarities and differences. You can identify a lot of differences in the two myths, such as the general creation of the world. In Enuma Elish, the world is made out of Tiamat's body, while in Genesis, God makes the world out of nothing, by himself. In Enuma Elish, there's bloodshed, feud, and violence, while in Genesis, God creates the universe somewhat peacefully and thoughtfully. There are, though, some similarities between the stories. They are two creation stories after all. In both myths, mankind is made out of the gods' images. It is the way they want it to be done. They wanted humans in the world to represent them. Humans were also the last thing to be created in both of the creation stories. We've evaluated both the Enuma Elish and Genesis through both the cultural and comparative approaches. It is very important to understand that the culture and the history of the myths and stories you are reading. It can help understand parts of the myth and the story itself. We compared both of these stories by using the same comparative approach and understand that these stories differ in some aspects and are similar in others. We used data from the two stories and were able to understand why some aspects in the stories differ. Works and Days versus the Agony cultural approach. Hesiod was one of the earliest Greek poets and is known as the father of Greek didactic poetry. He credits his poetic gifts to the Muses, which appeared to him while he was tending his sheep, and they gifted him his poetic talent. Culturally, it was difficult to analyze these stories because they are written by the same person. He was a peasant, so his view on the world was quite negative. He never really had a good life. He influenced Greek culture, though, through these stories. Works and Days versus Theogony, comparative approach. Although Hesiod wrote both of these myths, these stories differ from one another greatly. Theogony explains the origin and family of the Greek gods and the creation of the world. Works and Days, however, are more focused on the human condition, but it still overlaps with some of the things mentioned in Theogony. He mentions a lot in the Works and Days about humanity and the hardships that humanity has, especially being a peasant like himself. Using the comparative approach, we can analyze Pandora, who is represented differently in these two stories. It is mentioned that she is in both. In Theogony, Pandora brought evil and grief to mankind. In Works and Days, Pandora had to open a box and hope remained in that box. I'll be using the comparative and cultural approaches to analyze and compare Romeo and Juliet and 50 First Dates. I know these seem a bit random, but if you look deeper into the plot of each, there are interesting similarities and differences of both. Culturally, you could easily spot the differences in the characters because their image of love is much different. Romeo and Juliet is set as a much different time where love and times were different. In 50 First Dates, it was set in the 2000s, and culturally, the idea of love meant something that was completely different. Now, we could compare these two stories for hours, but you can identify the similarities and differences in only the plots and the characters. Comparatively, both Romeo and Adam Sandler wanted the girl of their dreams, but there was a problem for the both of them. Adam Sandler obviously couldn't have his girl because she had a memory problem, and Romeo couldn't have his girl because of the family problems. I think that using the approaches on modern narrative is much harder because it has more modern tone and is much more straightforward. Approaches in conclusion. Using the cultural and comparative approach may be harder to use in modern narrative, but it helps understand it, especially when you're comparing a modern narrative to a myth or an earlier narrative. It seemed that modern myths sometimes lack cultural history. Understanding a narrative culture when it's a movie is vitally important. I think before you'd watch the Titanic movie, for example, you should learn and understand about the Titanic and how it came to be. This is an example of a myth, but it's an example of a previous narrative. When we compare modern narrative, there are plenty of things to talk about, and we do it all the time. If you were just talking to your friend about the movie you watched, you compare it to another one. You're comparing narratives, modern narratives. You just use the comparative approach to further the understanding of both movies.